ちょうど1年前に株式がスーパーバブルのサイクルの中にあるとして、あと数ヶ月で株はクラッシュすると予言し、大きく外したジェレミー・グランサムですが、引き続き現状の株式市場に対して下方向に大きく賭けていることを明かしました。そして私たちは引き続きインフレと労働力不足に見舞われると言っているんです。次のマーケットクラッシュでは 50% もの暴落を見込んでいるというジェレミー・グランサムですが、今回の動画では彼がなぜ今の状況をスーパーバブルと思っているのか、それがどのように弾けると予想しているのか見ていきたいと思います。ジェレミー・グランサムが現状をどう見ているのか聞いてみましょ
う。Exactly how the great bubbles have broken.The blue chips, the S&P 500, have kept strong right up to the last second, and wave after wave of the stocks that had made the real running peel off and drop. The really classic example of this is the Russell 2000, which is stock number 1001 to 3000. They're multi-billion-dollar companies. They're a serious enterprise. In the last year, they are down.They have not made any money at all. The S&P's made 23%. The Russell 2000 is meant to go up about 1.2 times the market. In a bull market like you're saying there was, it should have been up about 30%. It wasn't even up recently. This is a huge divergence of a kind that has never happened other than the super bubbles of 1929 and 2000.NASDAQ has started to weaken relative to the blue chips. The Russell has started to weaken much more so even than NASDAQ. That I wasn't quite as certain about this bubble a year ago as I had been about the tech bubble of 2000, or as I had been in Japan, or as I had been in the housing bubble of 2007.I used to think then in terms of near certainties. This time I felt highly likely, but perhaps not nearly certain. Today, I feel it is just about nearly certain now. I think the crazy behavior, the peak of crazy behavior is behind us. I really do. I think we're now in the buy the dip mode, which the super bubbles specialize in. You don't have 2 years of buying frenzy dying overnight typically. So even in 1929 you had some magnificent rallies, and buy the dip is the watchword of practically every brokerage house out there, and it always is. You never, almost never, have a major brokerage house say the game's over. Most of the great bubbles, the super bubbles, go below trend and stay there for quite a while. In the Greenspan era, that tendency stopped. In 2000, yes, the NASDAQ came down 82%, which was fairly brutal. Amazon came down 92%. But the Federal Reserve raced to the rescue so loudly and strongly that they stopped the decline in the S&P at trend line. It only declined 50%. 50% is a hell of a big decline, but it was only enough to get it back then to trend. This time trend is at most 2,500. And I would expect, even if the Federal Reserve tries to do the same, it will be hard to prevent the market from declining to that level. We are indeed short a decent amount of Russell 2000s. So we haven't been hurt in the last year, which is amazing. We're also short about half as much again as in the NASDAQ, which did hurt us, but not sensationally. Indices I would short, if I was up for that, would be the Russell 2000, because they have a high density of flaky companies that aren't making any money, and the NASDAQ, which also has a high percentage of companies not making any earnings at all. What makes the NASDAQ more complicated is that it has these remarkable FANG stocks in it.
ラッセル2000とはアメリカの小型株の代表的な指標のことで、米国市場における時価総額上位3000銘柄のうち、時価総額上位1000社を除いた1001社から3000社の2000銘柄で構成されています。 米国市場の時価総額のおよそ 10% を占めると言われており、米国の小型株ファンドの 95% がベンチマークとして採用しているんです。小型株の動向を見るには、まずラッセル2000を見るといった感じではないでしょうか。ラッセル2000は小型株で構成されていることから、景気に敏感に反応する傾向にあり、暴落の先行指標や炭鉱のカナリアとも呼ばれているんです。そのラッセル2000が過去1年においてあまり良いパフォーマンスを出していません。ジェレミー・グランサムはまさにこのような動きが暴落の前触れだと言っているんです。
A standard bubble we defined over 20 years, perhaps 25 years ago, as a 2 sigma statistical event. It's just a measure of how much of an outlier you are. So you have a historical
deviation
series.
From trend.
Yeah, you have a price series of the S&P. You can calculate a trend. Statistics 101 is not difficult, and you can work out how far away from trend you are. And a 2 sigma is the kind of deviation that should occur every 44 years. And because we're a little wilder and less efficient than we should be, it occurs every 35 years. It's not bad. Every 35 years feels about right. One a career, twice a lifetime. That feels like a pretty decent definition of a bubble. And a 3 sigma should occur every 100 years. Now we, as I like to say, we do crazy pretty well as a species. So they occur much more, 2 or 3 times more often than they should. So 2 sigma, you can have some fairly standard bubbles. They give you a certain amount of pain, 30, 40, 50% pain. Super bubbles can really wipe you out like 1929 did. That's where we are now. We entered a few months ago into 3 sigma territory, super bubble territory. And the other great risk is last year we also entered bubbles in real estate. So this is a very dangerous year that we've just had.
If the super bubble bursts, as you predict it will, what happens? What happens to the economy? What does history tell us?
Some bubbles are very specialized to US growth stocks, like 2000. And they hurt. There is a wealth effect. People lose money. They pull back on their spending. But they don't hurt anywhere near as much as when you combine that with a housing bubble. So in 2008, where we had the only housing bubble in American history, that burst and the stock market came down 50%. Then you're talking serious damage to the economy through the income effect. Because this time we have, as a multiple of family income, US housing suddenly is more overpriced than it was ever in the housing bubble of 2006 to 2008. And it got there this last year since we last spoke. The biggest increase, 20%, that the US housing market index has ever had has taken it to a new high. And they are, in the US, still much cheaper than Canada, Australia, New Zealand, London, Paris, etc. So that is a global event that could cause enormous pain. So we have a housing problem, we have a stock market bubble like 2000, we have overpriced commodities, we have, of course, the lowest real rates in the history of man. It's that it will always be part of the discussion from now on, in my opinion. Instead of forgetting about it, it will be spiking and irritating and falling back and then spiking again. It will be part of the scenery in the way it used to be in the second half of the 20th century. There's a lot about this economy, I think, that will be dragged back into the late 20th century. We've had a very, very abnormal honeymoon Goldilocks period for 20 years, which I think is ending. Let me put it this way. We're in the early stages of running out of raw materials. Of course, we live on a finite planet. There's only a certain amount of cheap oil, cheap nickel, cheap copper, and we're beginning to hit some of those boundaries. And we're going to have bottlenecks here, there, and everywhere. The food price index of the UN is about as high as it gets. Growing food is not getting easier. Climate change.
The Federal Reserve is confident that it can contain inflation with a series of incremental rate hikes. What do you think it'll take?
I think the Fed absolutely does not get the pain that's involved with a bubble breaking. You can see that in the history of the last 50 years. Greenspan encouraged the tech bubble, He bragged about the productivity gains from the internet that would last forever. Actually, productivity has declined slowly but surely since then. When it broke, it caused a lot of pain. Bernanke learned nothing. He encouraged the housing bubble. He denied its existence, even though it was a 3 sigma, 1 in a 100-year event that had never occurred in American history before. And what have we learned? We just went straight back into the game, overstimulating, pushing the rates down, down and down they have gone for 50 years. So they started at 16% on the long bond, and now the real return you would get is -2. They act as if a low rate is a panacea and comes with no downside. That is clearly nonsense. It's created, I think, the biggest evil in our society, and that is inequality. If you drive up the price of assets systematically, and it's bound to happen if you drive the rates down to negative territory, who do you make money for? You make money for the people with assets. Who owns the assets? The top 1% has 35% of all the assets. The top 10% have practically all the assets. What's the asset ownership of the bottom half? A rounding error, practically none. So you mark up the assets, and that's your contribution to society. What you're doing is pushing down on labor, pushing down on the bottom half, with no offset from increasing their assets, since they have none. And you're making the top 1% ineffably rich.
このようなジェレミー・グランサムの意見を馬鹿げていて、彼は同じことを何年も前から繰り返しているだけだという意見もあります。暴落のタイミングを言い当てることはほぼ不可能ですが、多くの著名投資家たちが今後金利が上がっていく局面で現状の市場に対して慎重になっているという事実は頭に入れておいて損はないのではないでしょうか。